Good morning and welcome to Trevor Phillips on Sunday, live from the Conservative Party conference in Manchester. There are few certainties in a political journalist's life, but one of them is that at a Conservative Party conference, the Tory faithful are looking to their leaders to deliver on three promises: lower crime, lower immigration and lower taxes. On each front, the Prime Minister is faced with a crisis. Most immediately this weekend, how to respond to the dreadful tragedy of Sarah Everard's murder and the many more like it. At least 79 women have been killed by men since her death in March. Second, even with military tanker drivers delivering petrol to forecourts, there still aren't enough drivers. And the prospect of Christmas dinner without the trimmings is looming. And lurking behind all of this, tax. The government didn't cause COVID, but it looks like they'll be asking us to pay for it. And at a time when everything else, from gas prices to grocery bills, is going up too. Well, can we stave off chaos? We'll try to see in the next hour. Here in Manchester, I'll be speaking to the Conservative Party chairman, Oliver Dowden. Winter's coming, so we'll also be joined by the King of the North. That's what his supporters call him, Andy Burnham. We'll ask former Chief Superintendent Parm Sanhu what the police have to do to win back trust. And we'll put the same question to former Women and Equalities Minister Nicky Morgan. Co-op Chief Executive Steve Murrells tells us what they're doing to try and keep food on the shelves this Christmas. And we'll be asking the architect of universal credit, Iain Duncan Smith, why he believes now is not the time to take away £20 a week from hard-pressed families. But first, Oliver Dowden. Good morning, Mr. Dowden.
Good morning.
Sarah Everard's murder was called the rapist by former colleagues. He had been seen exposing himself. His car was identified. Is there going to be an independent inquiry into how such a person could come to be a Metropolitan Police officer?
Yes, well, I agree with you. It is deeply, deeply disturbing, and I think all of us feel it acutely for two reasons. One of which is we've all walked in that sort of area. We can imagine that happening to one of our loved ones, and our hearts go out to Sarah Everard's family. But also the sort of things that you've described, the kind of warning signals that appear to have been overlooked. I do think it's important, as a first step, that Cressida Dick, as the Commissioner, properly investigates that. And I think we need to just let her get on with the job of doing that first.
Well, of course, the question that's being asked is, this happened on Cressida Dick's watch. The procedures that allowed him to become a Met Police officer and the culture that, as far as we can tell, appear to turn a blind eye, either developed or continued under her aegis. Is she really the right person to do that?
Well, you're absolutely right to highlight all of those concerns, and I'm very worried about them as well, as is the Home Secretary. The Home Secretary has made it clear, and I think the Home Secretary is clearly right in this, that she should allow the Met Commissioner to do the job of trying to sort this out and find out exactly how this happened. There are very serious questions to be answered about the kind of oversights that you've described. I think the best approach is the one outlined by the Home Secretary, which is that we allow the Commissioner to do that. But alongside that, the government is taking action. So just today, we're announcing £25 million for our Safer Streets Fund, which will help, for example, with CCTV and other things to help women feel safer on the streets.
I want to come to that. But let's assume that Cressida Dick does her exercise. Would you still rule out the idea of an independent inquiry into these vetting procedures? Because this is clearly not just a problem for the Met. This is a problem for every constabulary.
Well, I think it's important that this work is done, first of all, by the Commissioner. Of course, we don't rule anything out, but I think it's important first to understand exactly what happened, and if there are further questions arising from that, then it may be that we need to look at it further. But I think the first step is really to get to the bottom of it. That's what Cressida Dick has been tasked with. That's what she said she is getting on with doing. I think it's important that we allow her to do that. If it is the case that subsequently we need to look at it, then of course we don't rule that out.
This issue, this tragedy has thrown up some issues which are wider even than the police. Now, in your job as chair of the Conservative Party, you're responsible for party discipline. Philip Allott, who's the Conservative Crime Commissioner for North Yorkshire, told women this week that they needed to be more streetwise. Now, he's apologised for that. But shouldn't you have been on the phone telling him he had to go the minute you heard that?
Well, the Prime Minister and I were outraged by what he said. It was completely unacceptable. I've been very clear in condemning it. I know the Prime Minister shares that view. He did immediately apologise, and I think that's appropriate for him to do so.
Can women in North Yorkshire be at least clear that when you next offer a candidate for this role to the electorate, the name won't be Philip Allott?
Well, I'm not going to preempt the selection process.
You're in charge of candidates.
Well, we go through a proper, transparent process with that. But I be in no doubt at all that the Prime Minister and I profoundly disagreed with what he said. It was a stupid thing to have said, and he has rightly apologised for it.
But of course, if you lived in North Yorkshire and you had a vote, you wouldn't be casting it for this gentleman, would you?
Well, let's wait for the selection process for the new PCC.
OK, let's pass on from that ringing vote of confidence in Mr Allott back to this central issue. There's a suggestion that somehow the Wayne Couzens is a sort of single bad apple. That can't be true, can it? For example, other officers exchanged messages with him which clearly were part of this pattern of appalling behaviour. Do you think that those people should be kicked out of the police?
Well, of course, anyone who has breached police conduct rules should face appropriate disciplinary action. I do think, though, it's important, and I'm sure your viewers appreciate, and I appreciate, the vast majority of police officers do an incredible amount of hard work keeping us safe every single day. I saw that just yesterday when I visited Gold Command for our conference. 1,500 police officers working day and night to make sure that everyone's safe. Most police officers are deeply noble and committed to keeping the public safe. It is important, though, that, of course, we address situations where there rise the kind of appalling conduct of this person, and I think that's why the Met Commissioner is rightly investigating it properly.
You've mentioned the £25 million that the Home Secretary is committed to projects that are going to make the streets safer. The examples that have been given are locked gates to alleyways, better street lighting, CCTV. Can you explain to me how any of that would have prevented the death of Sarah Everard?
Well, those are wider measures to make sure that women feel safe and people in general feel safe, and those measures will help people feel safer. Clearly, there are questions about
none of that would have interfered with that.
And of course,
with what that man did.
You're absolutely right to highlight what I think is an underlying point about the fear that I have and others have that there will be a loss of trust, particularly amongst younger women with the police. And Cressida Dick has made it clear that she's got a big job of work to restore that trust. And that goes alongside, though, the kind of action in the Women and Girls strategy and in the Safer Street strategy, which is about making sure that people feel safer generally. There's no silver bullet to restoring the trust that people feel with the police, but I know that the Commissioner takes it exceptionally seriously about how we can rebuild that trust.
Well, here's one way you could address this. Another former female police chief, Sue Fish, who ran Nottinghamshire Police, has said recently that what should be happening is that we should be treating the issue of violence against women and girls as seriously as we treat counter-terrorism. Now, we're sitting a few hundred metres away from where the Manchester Arena bombing took place. 22 people lost their lives. The government, partly as a response to that, focused on reducing the threat through the PREVENT programme, which disrupts, anticipates, diverts people. Do we need a PREVENT programme for male violence against women and girls?
Well, actually, we're taking a range of measures to address violence against women and girls, whether that's in relation to our recent sentencing bill, which has massively toughened up sentencing, whether it's in relation to, in my former brief, ensuring that women and girls are safe online with massive fines for social media companies that fail to deal with this tide of vile misogyny that we see on social media. So the government is actually working across
but there could be
all
a specific
areas of
programme,
policy.
couldn't there?
Yes, although that said, Vicky Atkins, the excellent minister in the Home Office, is essentially coordinating all of that on behalf of the Home Secretary, ensuring that we have a joined-up approach to doing so, and has been specifically tasked by the Prime Minister to do that. And that's the approach we're taking. It goes across a range of different government activities.
All right. Let's talk about the other big issue of this weekend, that's economy, cost of living. You and your fellow ministers are telling us there's no shortage of fuel, but the petrol retailers say that the queues on the forecourts are persisting in some parts of the country, and if anything, they're getting worse. It really isn't stabilising, is it?
Well, I think it depends where you are in the country. So, for example, around here in Manchester, I was out and about yesterday. I didn't see any problems with petrol stations. You can get fuel pretty easily. Here, there is clearly a problem still in London and the southeast, and people feel deeply frustrated. And I share their anger and frustration not being able to get access to petrol. That's why the government is working tirelessly to resolve that situation. And just a further step we're taking is that from tomorrow, those 200 military personnel will be deployed to help drive tankers to ensure that we overcome this issue, which, as your viewers know, and I know you appreciate, it's not that there is a lack of petrol, it's about getting the petrol to the petrol stations.
But look, this is not just about petrol, and if I can give you an example, forgive me if I'm a little grumpy with you this morning, we couldn't get any pastries from our favourite coffee shop here in Manchester this morning. And worse still, they told us they didn't have paper for the receipts. So I'm not going to get my expenses from Sky News. We're facing a series of shortages, and there doesn't seem to be any consciousness in government about what is really going on on the ground. We're getting a lot of reassurance, but we're actually not getting our buns.
Well, I very much hope you got your pastries in the end. I think I've got some spare pastries in my room. I can bring them to you afterwards if you're still feeling peckish. But on the more serious underlying point about supply chains, there are challenges with supply chains. We're not unique in the UK in this. For example, if you look across Poland, the US, other countries, there are shortages of drivers. That's to do with a range of factors, not least the fact that testing wasn't happening during COVID. You've got an ageing population of drivers. But we are taking steps to address that, whether that is extending the amount of time before you have to renew your licence, whether that is beefing up capacity to do tests. We are dealing with those issues across the board.
But you can't promise me that there's going to be turkey. There's going to be turkey on the table at Christmas, can you?
We will make sure that people have their turkeys for Christmas, and I know that the Environment Secretary George Eustice, this is absolutely top of his list.
All right. You are now in charge of the electoral machine for the Conservatives. Has the Prime Minister told you to get ready for an election in 2023?
Well, the Prime Minister has told me to make sure that the Conservative Party machine is ready to go for an election whenever it comes, but also to make sure that I, as the Conservative Party chairman, am a strong voice for the Conservative Party and for Conservative values, including in the media in this discussion that we're having now.
So we could be asked to vote again in 2023?
No, that right now we are absolutely focused on getting on with the job of making sure that we deliver for the British people. I can assure you that Prime Minister, Chancellor, Home Secretary, they're not speculating about elections. Day in, day out, sleeves are rolled up. They're focused on delivering what matters to
But you know
people.
I'm going to ask you, you're not going to rule out a 2023 election?
It's not my job to call an election, but we know full well that the usual electoral cycle would take you through to 2024, but that's entirely up to the Prime Minister.
One last thing. When you get there, what are you going to be telling us? There is a question at the moment about whether Conservatives are truly Conservatives. Biggest tax rises, biggest tax burden, I beg your pardon, since the war. No sign of any cuts in taxes. Can you rule out, and I know you'll say this as a Chancellor, but let me put it this way. Would you, Oliver Dowden, be opposed to any further tax rises before the next election?
Well, the Conservative Party has always been the party of low taxes, and indeed we've cut taxes.
Well, you're not today, are you?
No, but Trevor, you look at our record in office...
2.25% on national insurance.
But I'll come to that in a second, but if you look at our record in office, since 2010, we massively increased the personal allowance, delivering a huge tax cut to millions of working families. Of course, we had to deal with this COVID crisis, and we were faced with a choice. Did we get the resources into the NHS so it recovers from COVID? I think it was the right thing to do. And did we pay for that properly? Did we burden our children and grandchildren with more borrowing, or did we take the difficult decision up front? And I think that is entirely consistent with a Conservative principle of sound public money, living within your means, making sure we don't pass on burdens to our children and grandchildren. But as soon as we can make sure that we keep the tax burden low and reduce it, of course we will do so.
Oliver Dowden, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, it seems unlikely that the city's mayor can expect a comradely greeting from the Conservative Party conference, but some think that he's the leader of the opposition's biggest threat, so who knows? I'm joined by Labour's Andy Burnham, who's just down the road in Salford. Good morning, Mr Mayor. Now, you aren't responsible for the Metropolitan Police, but you pointed out yesterday that you took action to change the leadership in Manchester when you thought they weren't doing their job. Harriet Harman says that Cressida Dick has to go because she can't inspire trust. Keir Starmer says she should stay. Is Harriet right or Keir?
So it's very difficult for me to comment on that, Trevor, because as you pointed out, I do have the formal responsibility of assessing the performance of a chief constable and, where necessary, making a change, which I did late last year. So, if I were to pass comment on this situation, obviously it has some wider resonance than me just being, giving an off-the-cuff view. And because I don't have, the inside information, to be honest, I'm not going to pass a sort of knee-jerk view. The only thing I would say is, obviously, this is the most senior policing position in the land. We have a woman in that role. I would say that should give some confidence that from here, a convincing strategy can emerge from the Met, but more broadly, to tackle violence against women and girls.
Well, you say that, but a former Chief Constable, Sue Fish, who ran Nottinghamshire, I was just talking to the Conservative Party chair about what she said. One of the other things that she said in an interview yesterday was that when she tried to draw attention to some of these issues, she was denigrated, isolated and marginalised by many senior people, including, and she names her, Cressida Dick. Now, of course you can't make a judgment, but do you think that given what is now being said and the issue of confidence, do you think it is reasonable for Londoners to feel that Cressida Dick is the right person to solve the problems that have occurred on her watch, given your experience in Manchester?
Well, it's certainly reasonable for the question to be asked and for the debate to be had. Of course, that's the case, Trevor. But, it wouldn't be right for the Mayor of Greater Manchester to be telling the Mayor of London, or indeed Londoners, who should run the Metropolitan Police. I will, if you don't mind, leave that question to them. What I would say is some of the statements that came out from the Met over the weekend felt like they were going down the wrong track. Women should wave down a bus. Any answer to this issue that begins with the words women should or women must is, in my view, the wrong answer. This is an issue that starts with men and boys, and that is where attention should go. And I would say all of us actually need to start building from that starting point. I am going to lead personally a high-profile public education campaign in Greater Manchester aimed at men and boys, which will talk about how our behaviour can make women feel when perhaps they're out late at night on public transport or walking in a dark street. I think we need to take this much more seriously. I speak to my teenage daughters. My youngest daughter the other day says, wolf whistling is just kind of routine. but it has an impact. And how can that be right? 40-year-old men wolf whistling 16-year-old girls, that kind of thing. People should be embarrassed to do that. That kind of thing has to be called out. And actually, Trevor, other men have to call it out against friends who do it. And this is the kind of conversation I think we now need to have about this issue, rather than lurching to knee-jerk solutions that might please a headline in a newspaper, but not actually provide a solution.
Indeed, and you've pointed out, this is not just a London or a Met problem. What happened here in Manchester after the Manchester Arena bombing was a real renewed focus on counter-terrorism. Some people have been saying that actually we need that level of focus on the question of violence against women and girls. Would you support the proposal that I think has come forward today, that there should be a prevent programme, diversion, interception, identification of likely offenders? There should be a prevent programme that focuses on violence against women and girls, that is as resourced and as significant as the one that we've used against Islamist terrorism.
So I probably wouldn't call it that in terms of a prevent programme, or make the direct correlation with terrorism. But if you're saying there's a need for a national programme where this is taken much more seriously, and all police forces in England and Wales are required to make this a high priority, which it would seem the government is currently resisting, then yes, I would absolutely say yes to that. Because I do think this needs sustained effort on every single level. At the front door of the police station, in terms of how police treat victims, the training for police officers, but that broader public education campaign I was talking about a moment ago. So absolutely yes to a national resourced programme that kind of takes this whole issue into a completely different space with regard to the focus that it gets. And for me, that is what was coming out after the appalling murder of Sarah Everard. That was the call coming from women and girls right across the country. And it has to be heard, Trevor. I think there's a danger of words, not deeds here. And I think we need the opposite. We need to see action against violence against women and girls. In the aftermath of Sarah's murder, I brought forward the conversation on the strategy to tackle this issue here in Greater Manchester. And we've just passed our strategy in just the last week. So we are taking it seriously, but I would only support a national programme to give further support to that.
I'd like to get on to levelling up very quickly, but very briefly, would you support an independent inquiry into the vetting procedures, which applies to all constabularies? Because we've now learnt that this man, Couzens, could even now have got through the vetting procedures that gave him a uniform and a warrant card.
Yes, in a word, I would. I think that does need to be looked at. And I also think there needs to be an inquiry into the broader culture within police forces. And we're certainly doing that here in Greater Manchester, because we've acknowledged the culture in our own police force hasn't been right. But perhaps some of those subcultures within police forces, those closed WhatsApp groups. So I think all of this is where we need to go, perhaps as part of that national drive that you were pointing to. I think what is indisputable is that this issue needs to move up several rungs up the ladder in terms of the prioritisation, and that much is unarguable, I would say, Trevor.
OK. You and the other big city mayors met the Prime Minister this week. You now have a new Secretary of State for levelling up in the shape of Michael Gove. If you'd had your choice, would it have been Michael Gove?
Do you know, I think it probably would, given the choice of ministers around, because while I don't always agree with him, Michael does bring real energy to what he does, intellect, and I would expect that levelling up won't remain undefined for much longer now Michael is in charge of the brief. So I actually think it was good news for levelling up. We haven't met the Prime Minister, actually. We met Michael last week and had a very good conversation with him. And as the Conservatives come to Manchester for their conference, I'm not going to rerun the arguments of 2020. We're still sore, if we're honest about that. The pandemic has hit us really hard. But I don't think it would get the people here anywhere. So what I'm saying to Michael Gove and the Prime Minister as they arrive here in Manchester is, here is a big positive offer from us. Let us help you define levelling up, and let us help you deliver levelling up. And in our case, that means a London-style public transport system for Greater Manchester, crucially with London-level fares, where it's £1.55 to catch a bus, compared to the £4 or more that people have to pay here.
But can I just put this to you? You've made this transport plan the centrepiece of your proposals for levelling up. Can I tell you what I think they're saying in, well, I know, because they said it to me, in Rochdale and Oldham and Bolton? This is all very well, but this is just Andy's plan to allow us to have to travel into Manchester Central, but actually none of this is going to help the really depressed parts of Greater Manchester, who are the Rochdales and the Oldhams and to some extent Boltons. You can name them yourselves. That actually this is really a city centre mayor at work rather than a mayor for the whole of Manchester.
No, that isn't the case. I can understand why people say that, but Trevor, this system that I'm talking about would be for all 2.8 million residents of Greater Manchester, and it would better to connect them to jobs and opportunities in their own boroughs, but also further afield. And this place I'm talking to now is Salford. It's very hard to get from Rochdale or Oldham to Media City. So it would help connect people to jobs in any part of Greater Manchester. But the critical thing is this. Actually, we're already beginning to see how a strong city centre lifts the towns outside of it. Stockport has a mayoral development corporation where there are plans for 3,500 homes. And I would like to bring one to Middleton in the borough of Rochdale, just between, on the fringes of Manchester. We think this plan will help lift the proud mill towns of Greater Manchester, particularly those across the north. And so it's about town and city rising together, and we think we've got evidence to show that.
Andy Burnham, thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
Now, the murder of Sarah Everard by an off-duty constable who was known to some colleagues as the rapist has raised serious questions for the Metropolitan Police. The force has admitted making mistakes in the vetting process that led to the recruitment of Wayne Couzens, who this week received a whole life sentence. I'm joined now by the former superintendent in the Metropolitan Police, Parm Sanhu. Parm Sanhu, thank you very much for joining us. The Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police essentially said, she used the word a bad un, that Wayne Couzens was an exceptional case, a bad apple, as it were, a one-off, and that everybody else would be appalled by his behaviour. Do you agree that he's just a one-off?
Good morning, Trevor. First of all, what I would like to say is that the majority of police officers are good, caring officers who are there for the right reasons. Wayne Couzens was a monster in uniform. But unfortunately, there is a culture where he was allowed to flourish, and the WhatsApp group that he was a part of, and other people are, is just one sign of that. And I've heard other comments about right across the country about this sort of culture existing. I have experienced it, and I feel that it is time for all police officers and all members of the public to stand up and say enough is enough.
You just said WhatsApp groups are. Are you aware that these kinds of WhatsApp groups still exist amongst police officers?
I am aware because I even spoke to one of my colleagues yesterday, and when officers, whether they're male or female, some of them are calling it out, and when they do call it out, they are then denied job opportunities, contracts are not extended, and they are the ones who get vilified. In my view, what we should be doing, and I've talked about this before, is there should be a support bubble around individuals who are strong enough and brave enough to fight this. But it should go one step further. We should be actively encouraging people to come forward and say, this is not right, this is what's happening and let's take action together. But moving on from that, it's not just about police. This is a societal issue. And when we talk about deaths, there are more deaths through domestic violence than there is through counter-terrorism or knife crime. Yet we have task forces, we have units that deal with those particular crimes. How come we don't have anything like that for domestic violence? How come we don't have the same sort of money being spent on it?
I'd like to come back to the wider set of issues in a moment, but just sticking with the police for the moment, is it your belief that there could be other Wayne Couzens types of people currently wearing the uniform, carrying a warrant card, and that the current vetting procedures and management procedures of the Met and other police forces simply won't be picking them up?
I have real serious concerns about the vetting procedures. This man not only got through the vetting after indecency offences in 2015, in 2018 he was taken in the Met. He was then given a gun to carry on the streets of London, so that was another form of vetting. I believe there are other individuals who have got questionable backgrounds who should be being looked at, not just in the Met, right up and down the country, and I think we have missed that. And instead of looking backwards, we should be looking forwards and making sure that those individuals are targeted now.
Do you think that means that to understand how to target them, that there should be an independent inquiry into the vetting procedures?
There should be an independent inquiry, but in addition to that, everybody who works in policing now should be re-vetted. Those people who have got through the vetting procedure 20 years ago, 30 years ago, all of them, every single person needs to be reviewed, and if anything comes up in their past, and it doesn't have to be a conviction, it just needs to be come to notice, because this man did come to notice. So every person should be re-vetted and reassessed as to whether or not they are safe to be working with members of the community and members of the public.
To be clear, every police officer should go through the vetting procedure once more. Is that as a one-off, or do you think that's something that should be done periodically every few years?
It needs to be done now as an urgent measure to reassure the public and rebuild the trust and confidence that policing has lost. But it needs to be done on a regular basis so that we don't have anybody who can even come close to the actions of Wayne Couzens. We need to make sure that we restore that trust and confidence. And in my view, I've heard your previous guests who've spoken about the next steps, and that the Commissioner has reassured them that she's going to take action. Well, I haven't actually seen the Commissioner standing in front of a camera saying, "I'm sorry, and now I want to listen to you." I've heard her say sorry, but I haven't heard her say, "I now want your views. I want to set up a focus group, an urgent task group." I've heard the Houses of Parliament were also guarded by Wayne Couzens, and there's going to be an urgent review and inquiry into that, and there's going to be a conversation with the Commissioner. But what about normal people? What about the normal people who are walking around the streets of London? Who's talking to them? Who's listening to them? And I accept that the Commissioner's contract has been extended by 2 years. Well, let's make it a positive 2 years. Why, from now, the Commissioner has got 2 years to turn this around. She needs to be taking immediate action. And go on.
You think she's the wrong person to do this job, don't you?
It doesn't matter what I think. The decisions have been made, so we have to live with that. But now it's about making that positive difference going forward. And over the weekend, Scottish police have decided that if a lone officer stops a female, they're going to put their radios on loudspeakers so they can speak to the control room. How come we're not hearing that from the Met? All we've heard is flag down a bus. Well, that's okay, that's fine for the first day, for the first 24 hours, but we're not in the first 24 hours now. The Commissioner and the top team have had time to think about what's the next steps.
OK. Can I return to the wider point that I think you wanted to make, which is about the culture? And this is not just a question that I think applies to the police, but pretty much to every workplace. but you can tell us something about this. How is it that you think that Wayne Couzens, with all the points that you've made about him being identified, people knowing he'd exposed himself and all that, how is it that nobody said anything?
Trevor, I wish I knew the answer to that question, and I would be surprised if no one did say anything. I think that in the coming days and weeks, we may find that individuals did raise issues, but they were just not acted on, because there isn't that support, there isn't that strength of feeling to take matters further. And in a lot of cases, the canteen culture is such that, oh, she couldn't take a joke, it was just banter, it meant nothing. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the next few weeks we find that people did raise these issues.
Parm Sanhu, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Now, it emerged this morning that one of the jobs given to Sarah Everard's killer was to guard MPs at Westminster. I'm joined now by the former Women's and Equalities Minister, Baroness Morgan. Nicky Morgan, we learnt this morning that this man, Wayne Couzens, was assigned to the House of Commons to guard MPs, of which you would have been one. What's your reaction to discovering that?
Well, good morning, Trevor. Well, my reaction to that actually is that, of course, it's a development in the story, but actually this is not about Parliament. This is not about the guarding of Parliament. There's obviously an issue about vetting. I know you've been talking to other guests about that. But I really hope we don't make this about Parliament, because actually this is about the safety of women and girls across the country, many of whom don't work in a very protected place like Parliament and Westminster, and many of whom do exactly what Sarah Everard does, and they do it every day, which is to walk somewhere home, decide perhaps not to get a bus, to go for a run. And if they were stopped by a police officer, perhaps until last week, they would have done what they were asked to do. Now, of course, that relationship of trust between the police and I think many women and girls in this country is teetering on a knife edge. And there's a lot of work for the police to do. And I think we need to concentrate on that rather than this development about Parliament. And it may well turn out he's guarded other places too. We just don't know. But actually, it's about the safety of women and girls like Sarah Everard.
Parm Sanhu's just suggested that every police officer should be re-vetted. Would you agree with that?
Well, I would agree with that. And I think, as some of your other guests have said already, this is a much broader cultural issue. I mean, it's kind of inevitable that we are this morning talking about whether it's vetting or we're talking about how exactly Wayne Couzens got to the position that he was in, was able to move forces. And of course, that has got to be looked at. But there's also a broader cultural issue. I think what Parm Sanhu was just saying, it's in all workplaces. Actually, it's in all organisations and it's on our streets as well, whereby it is just appalling and unacceptable that women and girls do not feel safe when they are walking around, often in broad daylight. That's a cultural issue, and that's a cultural issue that the police have absolutely got to get to grips with. And frankly, that's the test for Cressida Dick. You know, I'd like to hear from her a plan about how she is going to tackle changing the culture in the Met and actually from all the other potential chief constables as well. You know, at that point, that's the test for whether she keeps the job or not.
Let's address this wider cultural issue. One aspect of this is who should be responsible for fixing the problem, as it were. Well, we've heard the reaction, for example, to the Met advice that women should wave down a bus. I don't think we need to detain ourselves on that. But more importantly, I suppose, I talked a little earlier on to party chairman about the remarks of the North Yorkshire Police and Crime Commissioner, who said that women need to be streetwise about when they can be arrested and when they can't be arrested. Oliver Dowden said he and the Prime Minister were outraged, but I don't think they were outraged enough to say this person should not be a member of the Conservative Party. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I have to say, I think they were incredibly stupid remarks, and they were delivered by somebody who clearly has never been in a situation where they have walked down a street and heard footsteps behind them and wondered, what's going to happen in the next couple of minutes. Got the keys out of their bags in order to be able to defend themselves if they have to, and frankly, for a police and crime commissioner to basically hint that actually women need to be more aware about and more sceptical actually if a police officer stops them, I think is frankly extraordinary. I mean, I have to say I'm not in favour. I mean, I hope that Philip Allott has been contacted by whether it's the party chairman, whether it's the Home Secretary, whether it's the Prime Minister, and asked to explain himself. And, again, at the end of the day, if somebody senior has said something or not done something, I would rather they actually admitted a mea culpa, I've got this wrong, here's my plan for doing it, rather than, throwing people out of the party or getting them to resign imminently. So I think we better hear from Mr. Allott what his plan is. And if I were a woman in his police and crime commissioner area, then I would want to hear from him what his plan is, actually make women feel safer when they're going about their lives.
But I suppose what I'm really trying to get at here is that this is an example of what I think you would describe as part of the cultural problem, that actually the big issue, Andy Burnham talked about this a moment ago, the big issue here is not that women need to fix this, but there needs to be something about the way that men behave. Now, one of the things we've heard about in this week is the locker room culture that female police officers describe. One of the reasons that you left the House of Commons is that you said that you got lots of abuse, and we know that women MPs are more likely to get abuse and be undermined than male MPs. Do you think we can do anything about this kind of culture?
The answer is I do think we can do something about it. And I know that there is a huge determination amongst ministers, amongst the Speaker of the House of Commons, for example, to tackle online abuse of members of Parliament, but also actually the new elections bill makes proposals about the intimidation of candidates, for example. But you're absolutely right, Trevor. This is a wider, broader problem that has gone untested or unchallenged for far too long. And of course, as well as being Minister for Women and Equalities a few years ago, I was also Education Secretary. And I heard what Andy Burnham said, and I think he is correct to say that actually this is also a challenge for men to call out when they hear unacceptable language or so-called banter being used. But actually it starts right the way at schools. And the PSHE curriculum that is so important in what it teaches both boys and girls about respect for themselves, about issues about consent, about the language that we use. When I was Education Secretary, I talked a lot about character. That's also about thinking about the impact that you're having on people around you, wanting to do the right thing, even when somebody is not looking. All of that. And then, of course, Oliver Dowden also rightly highlighted, and again, as a former culture secretary, the impact that the online harms bill will need to have about making sure, because sadly, a lot of the abuse I suffered and others suffer, I think is absolutely fueled by the misogyny that is allowed to go rampant on our social media platforms. And actually, that bill will be very important, again, in beginning to change the culture of those platforms, make those tech companies accountable for what's on there, getting that content off and being transparent about how they do that, and Ofcom policing that to make sure they are doing what they say they're going to protect the users of those platforms.
Indeed, just very briefly, of course, at the centre of this is still the issue of the way that women are spoken about and regarded and so on. And this is a non-partisan point. When Harriet Harman was in government, there were things said about her, obsessed by women's issues and so on. And we see, to some extent, the treatment of Liz Truss and Priti Patel. Do you think that actually there is a problem in politics that prominent women are not spoken about or regarded in the same way as prominent men?
I don't think it's universal. But I think a lot of the coverage of women in politics still focuses far too much on, obviously, what we are, how we are presenting, rather than what we are actually saying. I mean, I think we remember that picture. Do you remember of Theresa May and Nicola Sturgeon when they first met, and that, you know, that picture of them sitting there? And I think it was more commentary about their knees being on show than what they actually said in their meeting. And of course, I remember walking down Downing Street, and somewhere there's a very unattractive picture of me, because I was walking down with Amber Rudd, and the photographer shouted out, "Girls, girls," and I was like, "No, girls, we are secretaries of state." And I think absolutely the language that people use, as I say, about all of us, people in public life generally, obviously matters. And again, we all have to think about that at all times. It is much better than I think it was, but there's always room for improvement, not just in Westminster, in all organisations. And of course, the spotlight is very firmly on our police forces at the moment.
Nicky Morgan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, Christmas is coming, but don't assume the goose is getting fat. There's a warning that the supply crisis currently causing shortages at petrol stations around the country could also lead to empty shelves in the shops this Christmas. Steve Murrells is the boss of the Co-op, which has more stores than any other supermarket in the country except Tesco and Sainsbury's. Steve Murrells, there's a Co-op at the corner of my street. It's nearest grocer. Can you promise that I'll be able to walk to the corner and get sausages for my stuffing on Christmas Day?
Morning, Trevor. Thanks for inviting me on. Yes, I can assure you that you will get your stuffing at Christmas time, to coin a phrase. We're working very hard to get all of the Christmas favourites for our customers and members, and you should be reassured about that. What I can say, however, is that this isn't a Co-op problem. It's not even a national problem. It's a global issue, one that isn't going to be fixed quickly and will need real structural change. And as goods move across the world, they've become quite dislocated from its end use. So whilst the government's recent actions around visas and extending time periods is going to help, there is no doubt, this will take some while to fix and requires a real change in mindset on how we move goods around the globe.
I'll come to that in a second, but you said back in August that the shortages then were the worst that you had seen in your time in retail. Is that still the case today?
Yes, we're still seeing daily the challenges of this perfect storm, a storm that's affecting all retailers, all suppliers, and that is still with us here today. Things are improving, not as fast as we would all like, but yes, they continue to exist. And as I say, we're all working extremely hard to fix the issue, which is 90,000 HGV drivers too short from what we all require. Money is going to help, but it's not the answer here. It requires a complete rethink. And Trevor, as you know, we've just recently come out with one of the largest post-pandemic surveys around young people and their life aspirations, who I think can be part of the solution around the issues that we're facing today. But worryingly, they've told us that they... Sorry, you were going to say something.
Well, I want to come to that. I want to come to the longer-term issues, but you mentioned the 90,000 drivers that we need. Now, the government has said, in effect, this week, several ministers have made the same point, that the shortage of HGV drivers is down to you and your fellow industry bosses, because instead of training our young people, what you did was mainline on immigrant labour, which was cheaper and more easily available. In essence, this crisis is your fault.
Well, I refute that completely. Our role as retailers is to provide the best value for money that we can for those people that come and shop with us, whilst making sure that those that serve us are well rewarded for their efforts. This has been an issue that goes beyond retailing as far as the demise and the number of drivers across the UK. But again, I think that we have a number of solutions in our grasp. Young people will hopefully be one of those.
Well, you're going to be here at the Conservative Party conference this week, and I think you're making the case for greater skills training and so on. What are you going to be telling the Prime Minister that he needs to do?
Well, I think in the same way I'm saying the supply chain needs a structural change, we're going to need, if levelling up is going to be successful, a real structural approach to levelling up if we want it to be better and fairer. And as I referred to at the beginning, this recent survey is showing us that the younger generation can play a significant part in that agenda, but they are disengaged, and we need to listen to their concerns and their life aspirations, because they're telling us that they have no hope. So what I'll be talking about is how businesses like the Co-op, with government and local leaders, do need to come together to work on solutions and pathways for young people to achieve their full potential. And it shouldn't matter where you come from, Trevor, or what colour you are, or what gender or religion you have. I believe that all young adults and students need to have an equal chance in getting on, and I think that will be certainly a strong message that I'll be giving.
Steve Murrells, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, two things are due to happen on Wednesday. Here in Manchester, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, will make his keynote speech to the Conservative Party conference. On the same day, the £20 a week boost to universal credit introduced to help people through the pandemic officially comes to an end. I'm joined now by the former Conservative Party leader and the architect of universal credit, Iain Duncan Smith. Perhaps even more relevant, Iain Duncan Smith is a former heavy goods truck driver. Iain Duncan Smith, they need 90,000. I think you could be back on the road this week, and actually you could be earning even more than you do as a Member of Parliament.
Yeah, sadly, I didn't renew the licence about 15 years or so ago, but I am now looking into whether it was feasible to either get my licence back or get a test. Yes, certainly I would be game to get back in the cab, as it were. But the one thing I do know, the one point I was going to make was the one thing I do know about this crisis is that it isn't just sitting here because we left the European Union. In fact, it's the demand for drivers and the requirement for drivers was growing as far back as 2013, 2014. And I had, when I was Secretary of State working, had big rows with the hauliers. I gathered them in with the Transport Secretary and said, why didn't they train British drivers? And they said, oh, they just don't want to do it. So we bought 100 courses, got the price down, filled all of them with people who were unemployed, and ended up getting them all to pass. And I went back to them and said, why don't you do that? And they just shrugged their shoulders and said, oh, no, it's all too difficult. And in fact, the reason is because they didn't want to have to commit financially to train drivers. They just got them in from Eastern Europe. But that market was already freezing up. And even now in Europe, there's 400,000 shortage of drivers because of COVID and no testing, which the same applies here. So all these have got to get on with it and finance the training.
Well, look, I wasn't going to go there, but since you've raised Brexit, let's talk about turkeys. The turkey producers cannot get the labour to process and pack turkeys. We can't get turkey pluckers, and that is because of Brexit. Are you embarrassed that in order to have turkeys on the table at Christmas now, because of Brexit, we've got to import them from France and Poland?
No, again, this is all about planning, I'm afraid, and COVID too, because planning, first of all, because there are these short labour schemes that exist for people that do seasonal work. And so there are plenty of opportunities for people to come in to do this sort of work, as much as picking if they require to do it. That's the first particular short-term point. The second point, of course, is COVID meant that we had about 3 million people who are European Union citizens who registered here to allow them to stay and to work. COVID hit, many of them went back home.
Okay.
Many have discovered actually they want to stay. But the other bit I have to tell you is I met a very interesting man who produced potatoes. It's very important, this, because he cornered the market in the UK on frozen potato products in all the supermarkets. And I asked him how he managed to do that. And he laughed. He said, the UK is a cheap labour country. You've never invested in technology. You don't invest in people, and it's going to hurt you eventually, whether or not you leave the European Union. You have businesses that are not foresighted like we are, and therefore we beat them in the market because we invested in technology. That's the story, I'm afraid, of UK business at the moment. It's got to change.
All right, let's talk about universal credit, which was your creation. How did it feel to see it undermined by the £20 cut this week?
Well, actually, it was undermined under George Osborne when he took about £5 billion out of universal credit originally, when where we meant it to be. Some of that money's gone back in since, but it did require more investment. And I was pleased when the Chancellor put extra money in, because it ensures that people not just are supported well as unemployed, but are helped up the ladder very quickly because of the taper. It's not an unemployment benefit. It's an employment and unemployment benefit, and it works when you invest in it, because dynamically, the more people that move off into work, the lower the cost. So I would like to see them.
So you're okay with the cut, are you?
No, I want to keep the money. I think it's the right thing to keep this investment in universal credit. It's been a huge success. Of all the things that have gone wrong in the pandemic, universal credit is the one thing that's quietly got on and helped support people without having to queue up at job centres. So it's worth investing in. It also gets people into work quicker, so that's worth investing in. And finally, and the point I just made is, importantly, that money, that cost, will fall as people go back into work. So it's important that we do this. And even if the government's determined to do this, I would urge them to think about this over the period of the winter, not do it now, and think about it again in February, March as they approach the budget, when they know what the cost of living is, when they know what inflation is, and they know what the difficulties are in the marketplace. Far better to wait and see where we are, as we know things are moving in the wrong direction in those terms, and those will affect the poorest in society the most. So we need to make sure we keep the support measures in for them.
So you're going to keep fighting through on this through the winter?
Well, the trouble is, it's very difficult to vote. I tried to amend a bill the other day to get this changed. I suspect that bill will come back from the Lords amended. I just keep saying to my colleagues, we invest in the poorest and ensure that they have a route out of poverty through work. And universal credit was designed to do that, and it's been doing it brilliantly. So the old rule, you invest in success and withdraw from failure. This is a success. Use this. Don't invent other schemes. Use this.
You are a London Member of Parliament. Are the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary right to stand by the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police?
I have resisted calls for her resignation simply on the basis in the past that I feel like these things don't always change things in the short term. And when I saw the Secretary of State give her the second term, a much limited one, by the way, then I assumed that was because they were looking for somebody to replace her. I do think that the handling of certain events in London has not been brilliant. Anything from some of the protests, the prolonged protests now of the Extinction Rebellion crowd that have cost huge amounts of money, and worse in many senses, as an outer borough MP, stripped out the police forces from the outer boroughs, thus putting us in some jeopardy during the course of this. There's lots going on, and I think the issues around the recent murders, the female murders, and the terrible problems that have existed from that, I think there are issues here about leadership and focus. And I think the Met has got to sort of have somebody in charge now that understands the dynamic of what they do, how it works best, and that people can rely on them to be both forceful where necessary, but also helpful and can be trusted. And I think that's the bit that's got to be resolved. And it may require that she steps down and that somebody else is able to take over, because I think it is time now for a new broom, as it were.
You've been soldier, you've worn the uniform, you've held responsibility. It's a heavy responsibility to be a police officer, but this man went through the vetting procedures and got his uniform and warrant card. Do you think that actually the procedures are ripe for revision and that there should be an independent inquiry into the vetting procedures to become a police officer?
Well, of course, they'll have to look at those vetting procedures. But I must say, it doesn't take the smartest person in the world to ask this simple question. When a man who is a police officer, let alone anybody else, is caught flashing once and then again twice, what in hell's name is he doing holding a police badge and being able to operate on the streets? He should have been suspended, if not sacked, immediately, pending an inquiry on the first occasion. I don't understand how that man was on the street and thus able to murder Sarah Everard. We need to trust these people, and they have to be above any kind of possibility of accusation. And the idea that a man can flash as a police officer, for goodness sake, and people think it's funny, I think that's the thing that's really failed. You need to recognize that the police police with consent, and they are trusted. And therefore, anybody who's his colleague at the time who knew this was going on, why in hell's name wasn't he immediately reported, suspended at least pending full investigation, had all his cards taken off him, or sacked? I mean, I think that's simple as that. And you don't need to suddenly have a brilliant person come in and review your things that you do to assess people. What you have to do is say, that's it, he's gone.
Iain Duncan Smith, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Well, that's it for Trevor Phillips on Sunday, on this tragic and in many ways awful day. But we will be continuing to delve into the issues in a moment after the break with Deputy Political Editor Sam Coates in Trevor Phillips' The Take.